The most dangerous betrayals never come from enemies, the old bartender once told Naomi Brooks. They come from the people pouring your wine. Naomi remembered those words the moment she stepped into the VIP dining room carrying a silver tray lined with crystal glasses worth more than 3 months of her rent. The room glowed beneath imported Italian chandeliers, warm gold light reflecting across polished marble floors and dark walnut walls. Cigarette smoke drifted slowly through the air like storm clouds refusing to move. At the center of the room sat Adrian Castellano, the man newspapers called Chicago's Invisible King. 37 years old. White suit jacket perfectly tailored across broad shoulders. Steel gray eyes sharp enough to silence entire rooms without raising his voice. Men twice his age leaned toward him when he spoke. Politicians waited for his approval before touching their drinks. And tonight, according to whispers spreading through the restaurant kitchen, Adrian was about to sign the biggest deal of his life. $20 million. Naomi lowered her eyes as she approached the private table. Invisible. That was the rule for girls like her. Especially black waitresses working in places where wealthy men discussed money like they were talking about weather. She had learned long ago that powerful people only noticed servers when something went wrong. Careful with the wine, the floor manager muttered as she passed. These people don't tip girls who make mistakes. Naomi nodded quietly. Her black uniform sleeves were rolled neatly to her elbows, her curly hair tied back in a clean bun. Exhaustion pressed behind her eyes after a double shift, but she kept moving. Her mother's insulin wasn't getting cheaper. Neither was rent on the South Side apartment with broken heating and cracked windows that rattled every time the train passed. She reached the VIP table just as one of the investors slid a thick contract toward Adrian. Once you sign this, the man said with a grin, the ports belong to Castellano Holdings. Several men around the table raised their glasses. Expensive watches flashed beneath the chandelier light. Naomi carefully poured red wine into crystal stems while trying not to listen. But then she heard another voice. Quiet. Almost hidden beneath the music drifting from the piano downstairs. Transfer the offshore accounts after midnight, a silver-haired attorney whispered to the man beside him. By the time Castellano realizes the valuation was inflated, it'll be too late. Naomi froze for half a second. Just half a second. But it was enough. Her eyes dropped instinctively toward the contract lying open beside Adrian's hand. Numbers. Percentages. Ownership clauses. Her stomach tightened immediately. She knew those structures. Deferred liability transfers. Shell subsidiaries. Hidden debt cycling through offshore entities. The kind of financial traps professors used to warn students about during forensic accounting lectures back before Naomi dropped out of college to take care of her sick mother. You okay there, sweetheart? One of the capos asked with a smirk after noticing her hesitation. A few men chuckled softly. Naomi forced herself to continue pouring the wine. Her pulse hammered inside her chest now. Because suddenly she understood what nobody else in that room seemed to realize. Adrian Castellano wasn't about to become richer tonight. He was about to lose everything. And the men smiling beside him already knew it. Naomi kept her expression neutral as she stepped away from the VIP table, but inside, her thoughts were spiraling faster than the jazz music drifting through the restaurant. The silver tray in her hands suddenly felt heavier than concrete. She moved carefully between candlelit tables and wealthy diners laughing over $1,000 steaks while her mind replayed the numbers she had glimpsed on page 14 of the contract. Asset transfer percentages. Deferred debt allocation. Offshore liability routing through a Cayman subsidiary. It was not just risky. It was designed to collapse after the signature cleared. Table 12 needs another bottle, the manager snapped as Naomi entered the service station. Derek Malone barely looked at her while adjusting his tie in the reflection of the wine cooler. Tall, slick-haired, permanently irritated, Derek treated every waitress in the restaurant like unpaid furniture. And smile this time, he added. The VIP guests do not want funeral energy around them tonight. Naomi swallowed her frustration and reached for another bottle of Cabernet. Her fingers trembled slightly. She could still hear the attorney's whisper in her head. Inflated valuation. Offshore transfer. Too late. You look pale, another waitress murmured beside her. You okay? Naomi forced a small nod. Just tired. Tired was easier to explain than terrified. Because if she was right, Adrian Castellano was about to sign himself into a financial disaster big enough to destroy half the empire sitting around the table. And the worst part was that nobody would believe her even if she tried to warn them. Especially not Derek. Especially not men like Adrian Castellano. Naomi stepped into the hallway leading toward the kitchen, the polished marble floor reflecting soft gold light beneath her shoes. For a moment she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. Her mother would already be asleep by now in their apartment across town, television humming softly beside the recliner where she spent most evenings wrapped in blankets against the Chicago cold. Naomi pictured the orange prescription bottles lined beside the sink. The overdue electricity bill folded beneath a magnet on the refrigerator. The college acceptance letter she still kept hidden in her dresser drawer because throwing it away felt too much like admitting defeat. 3 years earlier she had been top of her forensic accounting class at the University of Illinois Chicago. Professors used to praise the way she could spot irregularities buried inside financial statements that other students missed completely. You see patterns faster than anyone I have taught, one professor told her after midterms. But talent did not pay hospital bills. So Naomi dropped out halfway through her degree and traded lecture halls for double shifts carrying wine through rooms filled with people who never looked her in the eye. Brooks. Derek's sharp voice cut through her thoughts. Move. Naomi straightened immediately as he pushed past carrying a stack of menus. And stop wandering around. Looking confused, he muttered under his breath. Those men out there are worth more money than you will ever see in your life. Naomi lowered her eyes again. Invisible. Safe girls stayed invisible. That was how you survived places like this. But then she glanced back toward the VIP room entrance where Adrian Castellano sat preparing to sign away millions of dollars to people already planning his downfall. And for the first time all night, staying invisible no longer felt safe at all. The restaurant grew louder as the night deepened, but inside Naomi Brooks's mind, everything had become painfully clear. Every laugh from the VIP room sounded distant now, buried beneath the calculations running through her head. She stood near the service counter polishing silverware that was already spotless while watching the private dining area through the reflection in the glass wine cabinet. Adrian Castellano had not signed the contract yet. The thick stack of papers still rested near his right hand beside a half-finished glass of Barolo. Men around him smiled too much. That was the first thing Naomi noticed. Real business meetings never looked relaxed when $20 million were involved. But these men looked comfortable. Certain. Like actors who already knew how the movie ended. Stop staring, Derek muttered as he passed beside her carrying a tray of appetizers. You are a waitress, not security. Naomi lowered her eyes immediately. Sorry. Derek scoffed softly. Those people out there could buy this entire block without checking their bank accounts. People like us are invisible to them. Do your job and stay out of grown folks' business. Naomi nodded quietly, but her stomach tightened harder. Because invisible people sometimes heard things powerful men forgot to hide. A burst of laughter echoed from the VIP room. Naomi glanced up instinctively just as one of the investors leaned toward Adrian and tapped the contract with a gold pen. You are making history tonight, the man said smoothly. Adrian remained calm, expression unreadable beneath the warm chandelier light. His fingers rested against the edge of the glass table, steady and controlled, but Naomi noticed something others probably missed. He had not touched the pen yet. He was still thinking. Still calculating. The attorney seated beside him opened another folder, exposing several pages filled with financial projections. Naomi caught only a glimpse, but it was enough. The depreciation timeline was wrong. Completely wrong. Her pulse spiked instantly. She turned away from the counter and walked toward the hallway leading into the kitchen, trying to breathe normally. Because now she understood the real trap. The fake valuation was only the beginning. They were using projected shipping revenues to secure liability transfers against future assets that did not actually exist. Once the offshore holding companies collapsed, every debt would redirect back toward Castellano Holdings. Adrian would not just lose money. Regulators, investors, unions, everyone tied to those ports would come after him at once. The empire would bleed from every direction. Naomi stopped walking. Her hands had gone cold. No, she whispered under her breath. She knew this structure. She had studied a nearly identical fraud case during her second year in college. Her professor called it financial drowning. Build the illusion of profit high enough, then let the hidden liabilities pull everything underwater after the signature locks the victim in place. Brooks. Naomi jumped as Derek appeared behind her. VIP room needs another bottle. She hesitated. Derek. I think something is wrong with that deal. Silence. Then Derek blinked once before laughing quietly in disbelief. Excuse me. Naomi lowered her voice. The contract structure does not make sense. The offshore subsidiaries are hiding debt exposure and, Derek raised a hand immediately. Stop. His smile vanished. You seriously think a room full of lawyers and investors missed something you figured out carrying wine glasses? Naomi swallowed hard. I am just saying somebody should double-check before he signs. Derek stepped closer, irritation sharpening his voice. Listen carefully. Adrian Castellano does not take advice from waitresses making $17 an hour. Naomi looked toward the VIP room again. Through the open doorway she could see Adrian finally reaching for the gold pen. And suddenly every instinct inside her screamed the same terrifying thought. If she stayed silent now, it would be too late. The gold pen hovered inches above the contract while candlelight flickered across the polished table. Every conversation in the private dining room seemed to blur together inside Naomi Brooks's ears as she stood frozen beside the doorway holding another unopened bottle of wine against her chest. This was the moment. One signature. One stroke of ink. And Adrian Castellano would walk straight into a trap designed by men smiling beside him. Naomi could feel her heartbeat climbing higher with every second. Her mind screamed at her to stay quiet. Stay invisible. Girls like her did not interrupt men like Adrian Castellano during $20 million negotiations. Girls like her got fired for speaking out of turn. But another thought kept pushing harder against her fear. If she walked away now, she would spend the rest of her life knowing she saw the disaster coming and said nothing. Mr. Castellano, one investor said smoothly while adjusting his cufflinks. I think we are all ready. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, the pen still balanced between his fingers. His expression remained unreadable beneath the soft amber glow of the chandeliers. Calm. Controlled. Dangerous. Naomi had spent 6 months serving wealthy men in this restaurant, and she had learned something important about powerful people. The quietest ones were always the most intimidating. The attorney beside Adrian slid the final page forward. Just sign here and we move forward tonight. Naomi took one step into the room before she could stop herself. Her shoes clicked softly against the marble floor. Nobody noticed at first. The investors remained focused on Adrian. Crystal glasses reflected warm red wine beneath the candlelight while cigar smoke curled lazily toward the ceiling. Naomi's mouth had gone dry. Sir, the word escaped barely above a whisper. But in the silence of the private room, it landed like shattered glass. Every head turned toward her instantly. Derek looked horrified near the service station doorway. One of the capos frowned immediately. "What is it?" Adrian asked without raising his voice. Naomi's fingers tightened around the wine bottle. Her pulse pounded so hard she thought she might faint. "I think," she swallowed hard. "I think the deal is dangerous." Silence. Complete silence. Then one of the investors laughed softly into his drink. Another man exchanged amused looks with the attorney. Derek closed his eyes like he already knew his shift was over. Adrian did not react at all. He simply watched Naomi with cold gray eyes that revealed absolutely nothing. "Dangerous," the silver-haired attorney repeated with a faint smile. "And what exactly qualifies you to make that assessment?" Naomi felt heat rise into her face immediately. "I just noticed some irregularities in the liability structure." A louder laugh erupted this time. One capo leaned back in his chair grinning openly now. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. "The waitress is auditing the contract." A few men chuckled around the table. Naomi's stomach twisted painfully, but she forced herself to keep speaking. "The offshore transfers redirect future debt exposure back toward Castellano Holdings. The projected revenues do not cover the liability spread." The attorney blinked once. Briefly. Almost too quickly to notice. But Naomi saw it. Adrian saw it too. Derek rushed forward immediately. "I am so sorry, Mr. Castellano," he said quickly. She clearly misunderstood something she overheard. "No," Naomi said quietly before fear could stop her. "I did not misunderstand." The room went still again. One investor smirked toward Adrian. "You really let your staff get involved in negotiations here?" Adrian ignored the comment completely. His attention remained locked on Naomi now with frightening intensity. "Come closer," he said calmly. Naomi hesitated. The air inside the room suddenly felt too heavy to breathe. "Sir." Adrian slowly closed the contract folder without looking away from her. "If you are going to interrupt my deal," he said quietly, "then explain exactly why you think it is a trap." Naomi felt every eye in the room follow her as she stepped closer to the table. The polished marble floor suddenly seemed endless beneath her feet. Candlelight reflected against crystal glasses and silver cutlery while the city skyline shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the piano music drifting faintly from downstairs felt distant now. Adrian Castellano sat perfectly still at the center of the table, one hand resting beside the unopened contract folder. Calm. Controlled. But his eyes remained fixed on Naomi with a focus sharp enough to make her pulse tremble. "Well?" he asked quietly. Naomi swallowed hard. Her throat felt painfully dry. Every survival instinct told her to apologize and walk away before she ruined her life completely. But then she glanced toward the silver-haired attorney whose smile had faded almost entirely. That was enough. "Page 14, Naomi said softly. "The offshore subsidiary transfer." One investor rolled his eyes immediately. "This is ridiculous." Another man laughed under his breath and reached for his drink. "Please tell me we are not pausing a $20 million deal because the waitress took an accounting class." A few chuckles spread around the table again, but Adrian never reacted. He simply opened the contract and flipped slowly to page 14. "Continue," he said. Naomi's fingers tightened around the wine bottle she still carried like a shield. "The projected revenue assets are inflated through temporary shell entities," she explained carefully. "Once the transfer finalizes, the debt exposure redirects back toward Castellano Holdings through deferred liability clauses hidden under the shipping expansion agreement." Silence. The attorney adjusted his cufflinks. "That is not accurate." Naomi looked directly at the contract now instead of the men mocking her. "Yes, it is. The language under Section 8 references future performance guarantees tied to offshore valuation indexes. But the subsidiaries listed there have almost no long-term operating history. They only exist to absorb short-term gains before collapsing. One of the investors scoffed loudly. You expect us to believe a waitress understands international finance better than corporate attorneys? Naomi ignored him completely. When the shell companies fail, the liabilities transfer back here. She pointed carefully toward the document. Directly to Mr. Castellano. The room grew quieter. Adrian slowly leaned back in his chair while studying her expression. How do you know this? Naomi hesitated for one dangerous second. Derek stood near the doorway looking physically ill now, silently begging her to stop talking. I studied forensic accounting before I left college, Naomi admitted quietly. I saw a similar structure in a fraud case study during my second year. One capo gave a short disbelieving laugh. So now we are trusting college homework over experienced lawyers. But this time, nobody else joined the laughter. Because Adrian's attorney no longer looked relaxed. A faint line had appeared near his jaw. Tiny. Barely visible. But Naomi noticed it immediately. Adrian noticed too. The Mafia Boss slowly closed the contract folder again, fingertips resting against the leather cover while the silence deepened around the table. Smoke drifted motionless above untouched wine glasses. Mr. Bennett, Adrian said calmly without taking his eyes off Naomi, is she wrong? The attorney forced a small smile. There are always risks in complex acquisitions. That is not what I asked. Adrian's voice remained soft, but the temperature inside the room seemed to drop instantly. Mr. Bennett adjusted his tie. The structure is legal. Naomi shook her head quietly before fear could stop her. Legal is not the same as safe. The words landed harder than she expected. One of the investors shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Another lowered his glass without drinking. Adrian stared at Naomi for several long seconds that felt impossible to survive. Then slowly, he slid the contract across the table toward her. Show me, he said. The contract felt strangely heavy in Naomi's hands as she lowered the wine bottle onto the edge of the table and leaned forward beneath the glow of the chandeliers. Nobody in the room spoke anymore. The earlier laughter had vanished completely, replaced by the tense stillness that settles over people when confidence begins to crack. Adrian Castellano remained seated across from her, his sharp gray eyes watching every movement she made with frightening precision. Naomi could feel her hands trembling slightly, but years of hiding exhaustion behind polite smiles helped her steady her breathing. Here, she said quietly, turning the contract toward Adrian. Her finger rested against a paragraph buried near the bottom of page 14. This section references future shipping guarantees through Blackwater International Logistics. Adrian glanced down. And? Naomi swallowed carefully. Blackwater International only became active 8 months ago. The company does not have enough operating history to support these projected returns. Mr. Bennett immediately shook his head. That is standard expansion structuring. Naomi looked at him directly for the first time all night. No, it is not. The attorney's jaw tightened slightly. Naomi continued before fear could interrupt her thoughts. The liabilities are hidden through temporary valuation spikes tied to offshore holding groups. Once the guaranteed performance numbers fail, the debt automatically transfers back through Castellano Holdings under Section 12. Adrian flipped several pages silently while Naomi pointed toward another clause. Right there, she said softly. The language says performance disputes must be resolved through arbitration selected by the parent investment group. One investor frowned now. What does that mean? Naomi looked toward him. It means if the deal collapses, Mr. Castellano cannot challenge the valuation in court. The arbitration board would already belong to the same people controlling the shell companies. Silence crashed into the room again. This time it felt heavier. Colder. Adrian's eyes slowly lifted from the contract toward Mr. Bennett. You reviewed this personally, he asked calmly. The attorney forced another controlled smile. Every international acquisition carries legal complexity. Answer the question. Adrian's voice never rose, but crystal glasses stopped halfway to waiting lips around the table. Mr. Bennet cleared his throat. Yes. I reviewed it. Naomi saw something change behind Adrian's eyes. Then. Not anger. Worse. Recognition. The kind powerful men get when they suddenly realize somebody they trusted has been quietly standing beside a knife the entire time. One of the investors reached for the contract now, reading faster as sweat gathered faintly near his temple. Another man pulled out his phone beneath the table. Nobody looked relaxed anymore. Derek stood motionless near the doorway like he had forgotten how breathing worked. Naomi stepped back slightly, trying to disappear again now that the words were finally out. But Adrian's attention never left her. How long would it take before the losses hit, he asked. Naomi hesitated only briefly. 6 months maybe. A year if the market stays strong. She looked down at the papers again. But eventually everything would collapse back onto your company. The debt exposure could wipe out your shipping division completely. One capo muttered something under his breath in Italian. Another investor abruptly closed his folder. The atmosphere inside the private dining room had transformed completely. The expensive wines suddenly looked untouched. The jazz music downstairs no longer sounded elegant. It sounded distant. Hollow. Adrian leaned back slowly in his chair, one hand resting against the contract while his gaze shifted toward Mr. Bennet again. The attorney avoided eye contact this time. That alone told Adrian everything he needed to know. Naomi watched the realization settle across the room, one silent face at a time. Men who had laughed at her 5 minutes earlier now looked unable to speak at all. And in the center of that silence sat Adrian Castellano, staring at the waitress nobody had taken seriously until she saved him from losing everything. The silence inside the private dining room became unbearable. Nobody reached for their drinks anymore. Nobody smiled. The warmth that had filled the room earlier was gone now, replaced by the cold realization that a waitress carrying wine had uncovered something an entire table of wealthy men failed to see. Adrian Castellano slowly closed the contract one final time and rested both hands against the leather cover. The movement was calm. Almost gentle. But every person at the table straightened immediately as if the air itself had tightened around them. Naomi remained standing beside the table, unsure whether she had just saved her job or destroyed her life completely. Her pulse still hammered inside her chest. She wished she could disappear back into the kitchen, back into the safety of invisibility, but Adrian's eyes never left her long enough to allow it. Mr. Bennet finally cleared his throat. Adrian, I think perhaps we should continue this discussion privately. Adrian ignored him completely. How long? He asked quietly. The attorney blinked. Excuse me. How long have you known? The question landed with terrifying softness. Mr. Bennet attempted another controlled smile, but it collapsed almost immediately beneath Adrian's stare. You are misunderstanding the structure. No, Adrian said calmly. I think for the first time tonight, I understand it perfectly. One of the investors shifted uncomfortably in his chair and began gathering his papers. Another quietly checked his phone again, avoiding eye contact completely. The room no longer looked like a celebration. It looked like a ship taking on water while wealthy men pretended not to notice. Derek stood frozen near the doorway, face pale beneath the restaurant lighting. Naomi could feel him staring at her in disbelief. An hour ago she had been carrying bread baskets through the dining room while customers ignored her existence. Now some of the most powerful men in Chicago were sitting in silence because of her words. Adrian finally leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. This deal is finished, he said. No shouting. No dramatic movement. Just 5 quiet words that changed everything. One investor immediately protested. Adrian, let us not overreact because of some misunderstanding from a waitress. Adrian slowly turned his head toward the man. The investor stopped speaking instantly. The only misunderstanding tonight, Adrian said softly, is that you believed I would sign something without eventually discovering the truth. Nobody answered him. Smoke drifted silently above untouched steak plates and half-filled wine glasses. Outside the windows, Chicago traffic glowed like rivers of gold beneath the night sky. Mr. Bennett attempted one final recovery. This can still be renegotiated. Adrian looked at him for several long seconds. You are done working for me. The attorney's face lost all color. Around the table, several men looked down immediately, unwilling to involve themselves now that the tide had turned. Quiet justice moved differently in rooms filled with powerful people. Nobody argued once they sensed authority shifting direction. Adrian reached toward the contract, closed it fully, and handed it to one of his assistants standing nearby. Have legal audit every agreement connected to Blackwater International before sunrise, he said. Every transfer. Every subsidiary. Yes, sir. Adrian nodded once before his gaze returned to Naomi again. She stood perfectly still beneath the chandelier light, hands clasped tightly in front of her black uniform apron. For the first time all night, nobody in the room looked at her like a servant. They looked at her like the smartest person there. One capo lowered his eyes awkwardly when Naomi accidentally met his gaze. Another man quietly slid his untouched wine glass away from himself. Derek looked like he wanted to apologize but could not find the courage. The room had gone completely silent again. But this silence felt different now. Respect always sounded quieter than arrogance. And Adrian Castellano, the most feared businessman in Chicago, was still staring at the poor waitress who had just saved his empire from collapsing. The private dining room emptied slowly after Naomi Brooks exposed the fraudulent contract, but the silence remained heavy beneath the chandeliers. Investors avoided Adrian Castellano's eyes as they gathered their papers and left without arguments or laughter. Naomi, still trembling beside the table, tried to return to work, but Adrian stopped her and ordered everyone else out, leaving them alone beneath flickering candlelight and distant jazz music. Calm and unreadable, Adrian asked where she learned to analyze contracts so precisely. Embarrassed, Naomi admitted she had studied forensic accounting at the University of Illinois. Chicago before dropping out when her mother became sick and medical bills consumed her life. Adrian listened quietly, unsettling her more than anger would have. When she explained she spoke up because nobody deserved to be deceived like that, something shifted behind his tired gray eyes. Most people in that room have known me for years, he said softly. You met me 6 months ago serving wine, and yet you were the only honest person there. 1 week later, Naomi stood outside Castellano Holdings holding a security badge identifying her as part of the Financial Intelligence Division. The former waitress who once carried wine trays through crowded dining rooms now entered one of Chicago's most powerful financial offices. Upstairs, Adrian confirmed his audit team had spent days investigating Blackwater International and discovered she had been right about everything. The fraud would have destroyed multiple divisions inside his company. But what impressed him most was not her intelligence, it was her courage to choose honesty over fear when nobody respected or listened to her. Later that morning, executives who once would have ignored her watched silently as Adrian Castellano personally pulled out a chair for Naomi Brooks at the conference table, and everyone in the room finally understood what dignity looked like.